Good afternoon. I'm very happy to welcome you on this Calista tête-à-tête interview session. Today is a special edition because it's about family offices and the world of private equity investing related to them. And it's also the first time I interview a very distinguished guest who actually is based in the US. So welcome, Ron Diamond. Great to have you with me today. We are together for a very special edition, as I said, because you've been active in the family office world for decades, and who can, better than yourself, can actually introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, Ron, and thanks for joining me for a short interview today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I love the work you do. So congratulations on what you've accomplished. My background, real briefly, I started work at Drexel Burnham and then Drexel imploded. I started a hedge fund, ran it for 10 years, sold it, and started investing. So how I got into the family office world was a bit serendipitous, but my thought process was I would put a little money into a deal, but I wanted to be the first call. But in order to be the first call, I needed to have access to other people's money as well. So basically what I did is, in my hedge fund, they didn't call them family offices in the 90s. They just called them rich people. So I had a bunch of rich people who are now called family offices. And if I put $1 or $2 million into a deal, that's great. I'll be the smallest guy on the cap table. But cumulatively, if I could put $50 or $100 million in with their money combined, I'll be the first call. So I kind of call it first call alpha. So I got myself into this crazy world, the family office world, which is, right now and I started speaking at these conferences, and it's a very inefficient, very fragmented, very siloed industry. Having said that, there's roughly $10 trillion in capital in family offices, and there's about another 65 trillion that's coming downstream from the baby boomers to the next gen in the next 15 years, which will be the largest transfer of wealth ever. So this is a massive market. And I think that if you look at every major bank, every accounting firm, law firm, they're all setting up family office divisions. That's where the money is. So that's kind of what I do. I invest personally, and I kind of act as a funnel. We don't charge anything, but I do it so that I get better deal flow and better execution.
Yeah, fantastic background. I think we feel there's a lot of overlap between our activities, and of course, down the line, we'd love to build bridge between the US and Europe, which are not sufficiently developed yet. And speaking of this crazy contemporary family office world, I think you described it well from the US perspective. Can you comment more specifically about private equity for these families? What is private equity for them? Is it a core source of interest? Is it a nice to play with? Or is it part of their DNA?
So 23% of capital from family offices is in private equity, which is about the same as real estate. Those are the two biggest asset classes. And it is that way just because they've been performing really well. The problem with private equity in general, and again, I'm generalizing, is that the private equity industry has become an AUM game. And there's become an inherent conflict of interest, because what should be a $300 million fund is a $3 billion fund. And I'll give you like a perfect, very short example of a microcosm of what I see the problem with the industry. I had a friend who did a roll-up of logistics companies, and he had a fantastic track record, and he needed $150 million. And he went to a placement agent in New York, and because of his track record, the placement agent was able to get him $500 million. So the placement agent calls him and says, I got great news. We're able to get you $500 million. And he says, terrific. I only need 150 and let's get started. The placement agent comes over to his house and writes on a piece of paper, 2% of 150 million equals X, 2% of 500 equals Y. What am I missing? And what my friend said is, well, if I do what you want me to do, there won't be a fund two, because my performance will suffer, because I can only deploy 150. I think that's just an example of what's happening in the industry. And these funds have just grown too big, and it's an inherent conflict of interest. Again, I'm generalizing, and if you look at the best performing private equity funds, they're not the KKRs who manage 20 billion. It's the much smaller to medium sized ones.
But the question is, do the families perceive the same issue as you do? Or do they not care about size? Are they looking at other KPIs? I'm trying to draw a comparison between US and European families.
Sure. Well, what's happened as a result of that is direct investments, which is your world also, has been huge. And more family offices are investing directly. Now, the issue with direct investments, in my opinion, is that over the last, post crash, pre-COVID, everything went up. I mean, if you're in private equity, venture capital, real estate, credit, Bitcoin. So a lot of families did these investments and they worked, and they didn't want to pay the 220. So they do the direct investments. The problem I think is going to happen is, as we head into a recession and the market goes down a little bit, a lot of these families will be over their skis. So they're going to need experts like you, like what your firm does, to vet this. And it's not that they're not intelligent, it's just they made their money selling Beanie Babies, or they made their money selling 5 Hour Energy or Guess jeans. And this is a totally different skill set. So I think that it's going to switch back. It went a lot to the direct investments, but I think you'll see it switch back, and people will look at sort of like what you do when the market goes down and realize how valuable you are, more so than they did in the time when everything went up.
I think we see this coming. We get more and more questions and appetite for SMEs and brick and mortar businesses, saying there's a bit of a tech startup fatigue in it by itself. And I think that's part of the role, that is to source investments that they can identify to where the adverse risk selection is more under control. At the same time, what we've observed, if you look at crypto, biotech, all these kind of high octane areas, often it's the families who are pioneers in these sectors. And do you think it's true? I mean, have you come across families who've been the first mover into these very innovative and disruptive spaces?
Yes, but remember, so we'll work with a family that made their money in healthcare, or they made their money they created an app, or they did a SaaS company. And that's perfect. And then in an ideal world, what they would do is they would be the ones vetting these deals in their industry expertise, and then other people would follow along. I think what's happened is, because the family office market this is a massive market, and it's very fragmented. I mean, the family office market in 3 years will be bigger than the private equity and venture capital markets combined. So that's a massive market, but there's no central clearinghouse, right? There's no infrastructure to do it. And so where do these families get their deals? Friends from country clubs. This guy's really successful. He's rich. He made his money in real estate. He's advising me on a biotech deal, but he's really smart, so I'll invest alongside him. So, in the problem, it's a good thing. The deals worked, but everything went up. So my 16-year-old daughter could have made money in the last 10 years.
We agree on the adverse risk selection. It's very big. Do your US family offices show appetite to invest in Europe?
Absolutely. I'm not an expert in your world, so I think that's where potential collaboration could be beneficial. But absolutely, they're looking for diversity, and my focus is strictly on the US, but there is definitely an appetite to invest globally.
And is it just diversification, or is it because what we observe, at least in tech, but also in SMEs, actually, the multiples are much lower in Europe relatively to the US. There's a bit of a catch-up happening right now. But in general, when you pay 3 times revenue in Europe, you will pay 5 times in the US. And 8 times EBITDA will be 10 times. So are they looking for more bargaining deals, or?
Yeah, but what I kind of do is, like with somebody like you, the first, second thing family offices need to do is they need to trust somebody. And if you look at it from an institutional standpoint, it's reverse, right? They want to know what your 1, 3, 5 year track record and your biggest drawdown, et cetera. So this is really an issue of trust. So once I have somebody that I'm comfortable with, that I could trust to do that, absolutely. The markets in the US are more overheated than they are in Europe. And, the multiples I'm seeing for some of these companies, the family offices, they've got the biggest advantage they've got is patient capital. So they don't have to do anything. Private equity firms, the biggest problem with their model is they're incented to flip companies every 3 to 5 years, irrespective of whether it makes sense for the company. And that doesn't make them bad people. That's kind of how the model works. So I think that, yes, there is definitely demand for private equity in Europe. But, prior to you, I didn't have anybody that I had a really close relationship that I trusted implicitly and I thought could add value, but that potentially can change.
We'll work on this, Ron. I have a last question. Most families like to invest internationally, maybe not in the US, but in Europe they do. Do you think club deals is something that they appreciate? If so, yes. And if not, what are the hurdles to being able to invest in a pooled fashion with other families?
The answer is yes, definitely. And families like to invest with other families, period, end of conversation. So they do like to do it. And in an ideal world, if they're going to invest in a healthcare, so Greg Wasson was the CEO of Walgreens, right? So we've done a little work with Greg. If it's a healthcare deal, who better in the country or arguably the world to look at a healthcare deal than the former CEO of Walgreens? So in an ideal world, he would kind of lead that and people would follow him. But in reality, that's not necessarily what happened. So what I'm trying to do is to kind of create an ecosystem where educating families on really best practices and how to invest and getting this inefficient, fragmented, siloed market and creating a network where their interests are aligned and they're working with the people they should be working with.
Yes, and I think the word we'll remember from everything you said, among others, is trust. So once the trust is established, everything is possible. Perhaps one final word on the perception of risk for families, because in the work we're doing, I find that risk has a very different meaning to what you see, from public markets and beyond. For instance, the situations where a lead investor has been investing in the sector in his past as an industrial entrepreneur. What are the other things that make families in the US perceive risk more or less positively?
It really depends. Also, part of it depends on the generation, right? Whether it's G1, G2, or G3. And remember, the whole family office model, I mean, the model itself is flawed. Only 25% of families make it to G2, 10 to G3, and 5 to G4. So everyone wants to be a family office, and yet the model is flawed. And then you add to that people like they'll sell a company for $100 million and they'll start their own family office. It's not enough money to have it's a lot of money, but it's not enough money to have a family office. In my opinion, if you're going to do what you do, invest in direct deals and private equity, venture capital, you need a bare bones minimum of 500 million. Otherwise, you're better off just going to like a multifamily office. And so a lot of these single family offices, in my opinion, are over their skis. And then, remember also 68% of the family offices that exist, there's 17,000 family offices in the world. 68% started since 2000. Half of those started since the crash. So this is a brand new industry. And I think we're only in the second inning. And I think people like you with what you're doing, you're giving it sort of some guidelines and direction and how to take this massive amount of wealth and kind of shepherd it and steer it in the right direction.
No, I think, first of all, thank you for all these amazing stats. I think you also put the finger on the idea that the reason why people come to us is they don't want to hire an entire investment team and a whole infrastructure. So it's in a way, it's an outsource model, but then you have to pull forces together with like-minded people like yourself. So the last thing we need to do then is to bring you over to Europe and introduce you some of our families and explore the synergies we have together directly right now. I think there's a lot we could do. Any message you want to send our families here in Europe from all the way from the US?
It's not a message specifically for investing. It's just a message about gratitude. And it's how I live my life. It just, sometimes you make investments that go down and they don't work out. And sometimes things don't work out, but there's so much we have to be grateful for. And I also think that the family offices can have a major impact in changing some of these from a philanthropic standpoint, from a societal standpoint, because it's not going to come from the government and it's not going to come from the public markets. It's going to come from the private markets. And just a perfect example real quickly is you look at what, my dad died of prostate cancer when he was 57. Michael Milken developed prostate cancer. Because of him, me and all the male listeners will die with, but not of prostate cancer if we live long enough. So, and you look at what Bill Gates did for the vaccine. So my kind of North Star is taking these brilliant entrepreneurs and using the business acumen they have, but to solve some of these real world problems. And I think that's starting to happen.
think it's part of stewardship and the duty that comes with having wealth. So beautiful ending. Ron, thank you so much. Look forward to welcoming you here, and we'll come and visit you in the US for some exciting coming together, whether it's deals or more societal projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
See you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.